Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Raymore City Council work session for Monday, September the 30th, 2024. We have a couple of items on the agenda this evening, the first being a data center presentation. We felt that with what's been going on in the region, that we needed to bring you all up to speed and do a little more exploratory investigating on our part to kind of set ourselves up for success if something should happen here. But tonight it's just a presentation on our findings. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Fearborn.
Thank you, sir. So just a little bit of history on this. A little over a year ago, I was approached by city manager in Peculiar asking if they could meet with us to discuss the potential that they had in place for the location of a data center in their industrial park that was going to be going in there. Told them sure, not quite sure what they were looking for, but the summary of the meeting was they had received an RFI and had begun, I'll loosely call contract negotiations, to have that group come in when they started to discover that in addition to the fact that what attracted to them to that location was the new power substation that was located there, they were finding out that these are also massive users of water for cooling, and of course you got to get rid of that water, it becomes wastewater. And the reason they wanted to meet with us is they had met with the city of Belton. Belton was not interested in entering into a partnership with them, and so they were, and I'm going to put this much more flippantly than it was actually presented to us, but they were wanting to know if they could basically hook a pipe into our Owen Good lift station to provide wastewater management for that particular location. Clearly didn't quite understand the complications that were part of Little Blue Valley Sewer District. That would mean a huge volume increase for us. What would it mean as far as strain on the station itself? Those talks led into a series of discussions with the fact that Little Blue obviously needed to be aware of the growth in northern Cass County that is associated with all kinds of different things and has led to ongoing discussions for the future of the possibility and the mayor and I had brought this up during budget presentation, of the possibility of a future sub-district just like Middle Big Creek, just in general to serve the needs of a growing county. So the conversation relative to the data centers kind of morphed into a more general conversation with, I think, peculiar understanding that it is a much more complicated and time-consuming, even for the wastewater, than they had originally anticipated. That did, however, lead me to direct staff to begin the investigation, which has been months in the making, of trying to get ahead of this issue, because data centers are a unique building use, they are a unique land use, they come with challenges, to say the least, possibly come with opportunities to go with that. But what we don't want happening is, and I want to emphasize, this meeting is to get out in front of an issue that does not exist for Raymore. We are not meeting here tonight to bring you a preliminary application. We have no applications on file. If we get one, as the mayor indicated, staff needs to have council direction on where you would be at. Staff needs to have council direction on if you would at least want to listen to it, what are the parameters that we would listen to it on? And we're going to have some kind of outline issues for you on that as we move forward. So we have actually done a significant amount of research on nationwide data centers. A few weeks ago, Mr. Gress, Ms. Lee actually visited West Des Moines, Iowa, which is a little bit of a mini mecca of data centers for Microsoft, and there is one up there for Facebook, Meta, at this point in time. So we wanted to bring the results of what we've seen to you all and kind of begin the initial discussion on this unique, challenging use tonight and start that discussion with you all and get a little bit of direction. With that, I'm going to ask Mr. Gress to take it from here.
Thank you, sir. We've prepared a little bit of a presentation for you all this evening, but before I turn that on and get into it, I just wanted to kind of tee up what our research has been. As Mr. Fearborn mentioned, we trying really hard to get out in front of this in case something presents itself in Raymore at any location. And so some of the work that Jordan and I have kind of tag teamed is trying to understand from a zoning perspective, because right now our code is silent on the use of data centers overall. It makes no reference to that type of use. And so as Mr. Fearborn and the mayor mentioned, we kind of need that direction from the council on what type of things do we need to be thinking of if we're directed to draft a zoning ordinance to update our zoning code. And so the photos and everything that you'll see tonight were kind of the culmination of a lot of our research before we went to West Des Moines and met with their staff, and then also several photos of kind of what we experienced as we went around to the 5 different data centers that they have under construction or already built. And then there's one additional one that was just approved. We also visited the city of Altoona, Iowa, which is kind of on the east side of that area. They have 2 data centers up there. It's more of a campus for Meta, which is Facebook. And so we were actually kind of clued into that one. Van Trust, our developer, is actually working in Altoona adjacent to that site. And so they kind of made us aware that there was a project over there that we should go look at as well. And so I'll direct your attention to the projector here as I kind of go through different slides and explain the different elements of the things that we were kind of looking at and hope to get some of your all feedback on this evening. The bulk of my presentation will focus on some of the more development standards, zoning standards, operational standards of what a data center should be required to follow if they were ever to locate in Raymore. And then Ms. Lee has some research from several different cities that she's had the chance to either speak with or hear from, more from the economic impact side, incentive type agreements or economic benefits or challenges that cities are dealing with. So again, just to kind of touch base on the 3 different topics of where our research has been. The first one is just the zoning standards of our code. As I mentioned, right now, not anything that's currently defined in our city code. So the first question is, how should those be defined? We've seen a couple different examples that are standalone facilities. We've seen a couple that are more campus-like in nature that have multiple buildings on them. And so trying to get a better understanding of how cities tend to regulate these types of uses. Where in general should they be located? Right now, we've got several different zoning districts in the city. And so if we were to entertain these types of things, where would the council feel like those are most appropriate? What's the review process for that type of application as they move through a potential location or any interest in the city? What are the baseline requirements that the zoning should have in place? And then in addition, the last point up there is from a PUD or kind of a supplemental special use standard, what type of things based on any specific location they might choose, what other things might need to be increased, like setbacks if they're adjacent to a subdivision or if they're adjacent to a school per se. So just trying to establish what the baseline is for any type of data center use in the city, and then more contextually, what makes sense to increase based on whatever site that proposed use might be going on. The next case was kind of from a development standard. So hypothetically, we choose a site. What are the baseline building setbacks that should be in place for this? All of our zoning districts, there we go. All of our zoning districts right now have a baseline development standard for a setback or a building height. Do those need to be looked at more critically for this type of use specifically? What type of sensitive land uses should the city be looking at to make those types of recommendations or decisions, whether it's residential or schools or daycares or any of those more sensitive type land uses that are typically regulated a little bit differently. Building size and height, we saw a couple different examples in our research of very large campuses. We saw a couple that were smaller buildings spread across a large piece of acreage. So these types of uses are fairly unique in that each building that we've looked at is a lot different than the last one that we came from. The other item would be just aside from the size of the building, what should these look like? Are there different architectural standards? If you recall in the Commerce Center right now, those are all tilt-up concrete panels that are assembled, kind of poured in place. Some of the cities that we looked at here have additional standards for, I'll use the case of Olathe. Right now, they require these buildings to look like office buildings. So you'll see a lot of, not fenestration, but kind of fake windows that are put on the outside of these with brick to make it appear like an office building. But of course, inside of it is a data center. So each city tends to regulate those things a little bit differently. The other thing that we came across is each one of these tends to fence and screen their uses quite differently. Our initial research was showing that maybe like sound barrier walls or concrete walls that would screen these uses from different types of adjoining land uses would be most appropriate. In our research, though, we've found that most cities tend to just increase what their landscaping or berming requirements are, in addition to pretty significant setbacks from their property line. And so you'll see a few photos that we took here of just how significant those berms and landscape barriers are, and kind of what your point of view would be from the road if you were driving down a road that had a data center on one side and some residential uses or other non-data center uses on the other side. And then lastly, the kind of operational standards for, if one of these is up and running, what are the standards that they have to abide by? They're, as Mr. Fearborn indicated, they're very heavy utility consumers. They consume a lot of water, a lot of power. They put out a lot of wastewater in cases where they're water cooled. And so how do you ensure that those utilities are sufficient, not only for that proposed use, but also the area around it, so that we're not taking away from other growth areas of the city by earmarking this type of utility consumption for one singular user. The other item would be noise and vibrations. One thing we found out is that these, they are very heavy power users, but in instances where the power fails, they obviously have either a redundant power system or backup power, so they use a lot of generators on site. So those, in some cases, generate some noise and some vibrations when they're on. We found some good examples in Des Moines where they've kind of oriented the buildings to enclose those pretty well, but wasn't the case for every site that we looked at. And so there's some thoughts that we had there in terms of how do you regulate specifically the backup power. That's kind of a unique thing that most projects in our city have not had. The construction process, each one of the facilities that we visited was under some type of construction, whether they were retrofitting or replacing items inside the buildings that were already built or building another building on the campus in which they've already had a couple buildings established. And then the last item that we were really concerned about was the site illumination and kind of how these are lit up at night, and how much that light was spilling over on any adjacent properties or kind of what the glow of those properties were. And so you'll see at the end of our presentation, we end up going back to some of these facilities at nighttime to kind of capture what does that look like. I wish I would have taken a picture for kind of comparison of what some of our other properties look like at night. Some of these pictures were taken from the highway, some are a little bit closer, so it's to compare those was a little challenging, but you'll see those here in just a few minutes. So I wanted to kind of start and just touch on just the buildings and what some of these ones looked like. In looking at the different ones we went and visited, there are some ones that were done very well. We talked to West Des Moines about from the first project that they approved in 2009 to the most recent ones. I think one of the things that they said is that the first project didn't have very strict building elevation. So you'll see it's kind of a, I won't say ugly building, but it's kind of a dressed down version of kind of a warehouse. And so this example here is actually, this was from Altoona, Iowa. This is the Meta location. And so you can see it's a mix of a fairly significant concrete foundation with kind of architectural metal panels. And this is what every one of those buildings looks like on that site. This is looking at the property from one of its two main entrances into the facility, and I'll show some other photos from around the site. This right here, if you can tell, I believe is the same building, just looking at it long ways. Each one of these, I think, was about 250 to 300,000 square feet each. And I believe this campus had 6 buildings on it. As you can see, kind of comparable size to the buildings that we have in Commerce Center, actually a little bit smaller, but the architecture of these were a little bit different than what we've seen in Raymore. This was an example of the first one that they approved in 2009, so you can see it does have more of a metal type warehouse appearance. And so, like I said, if there was one thing architecturally that we learned there is that, this could have been regulated a little bit better. This one was located pretty far out in a much more I'll say, secluded area that was pretty undeveloped. Some of the other ones were located closer into the city, which is one of the things that they mentioned. They didn't pay as much attention to the architecture on this one because it was so far out. The other ones that were kind of butting up to existing industrial development or commercial development, that's why you see the first example I gave looking a little bit more architecturally significant than this one. So we had a kind of a good idea of what their thoughts were on the look of the building. So these next few pictures will kind of illustrate what the setbacks are of some of these buildings and how far they are from either the road that serves the property or the main highway that some of these were on. In some cases, they were directly across the street from some kind of agricultural residential properties. And so you'll kind of see on some of these just how, what that kind of transition looks like. This video was, I believe, us standing on the... So a short video, but you can kind of see that's us standing on the highway that's right in front of this property. So you can kind of see the huge setback and landscape buffer that particular building had.
Was the sound that we heard, was that the highway or the, okay.
That was the highway.
That was not
Correct.
the center.
Correct.
All right.
So this was driving up, I can't think of which highway, but this is the Meta Center that was located in Altoona. So you can see it kind of butts up closer to the highway, and you can kind of get a feel for just how much of it you can see with the berm of the highway and some of the berms that project had built in addition to what was already existing. So you can just barely see the rooftop of those centers right there from their major highway. Again, this is two other pictures of that first video that we just showed standing at kind of the main highway. You can just see how far set back some of these properties are. This area was more of kind of a native planting area. There's a couple other examples that have a pretty nicely well-planned landscape buffer with trees that would eventually grow up to be to buffer that site pretty significantly. This is an example. The one thing that we talked about with them was, again, I kind of go back to our first thought was maybe the best thing is to just put up a wall so you can't see it. Their thought was if you're going to build a big concrete wall up on the property line, you might as well put the building up on the property line because it's going to look the same. And so they talked a lot about with their zoning standards, they put a lot of emphasis on the design and what the fencing and the buffers look like. So you can see on this one, it's a pretty architecturally significant fence. We only saw one project that had a pretty standard chain link fence. And again, I think that was the original one that they built 2009. All of the other ones were a little bit nicer looking fences. All of these were kind of enclosed by a fence along the entirety of the property line, so they're very secure. But through the entirety of this, again, this is in Altoona, this type of fencing exists around the entirety of that property, in addition to some other landscape berming and buffers on areas that were not adjacent to a highway or a major road. This right here, kind of I guess my attempt at an artsy picture, just to get it in the photo. But it just shows this is the main entrance into one of those facilities. This is the security entrance that you pass through as you enter it. And it was just an example of the architecture of what they put into it. As I mentioned, the first building that we looked at, a metal warehouse type looking building, their guard shack was kind of a 10 by 12 wooden shed. So we definitely saw both ends of the spectrum of what has worked well for these projects and what we can learn from in terms of what we probably don't want within the city. But this project in Altoona we thought was pretty well thought out in terms of its layout of the two different campuses, and definitely just had a nice design theme to it in terms of what it looked like. So these are some examples of what the property lines essentially looked like as you go up and down the major roadways or in between this facility and what may be some residential homes on the opposite side of the road. And so this is a video, I think, at a dead-end street. Or no, this is us passing the first project. So again, this is one of the only ones that had the chain link fencing. They had some pretty significant landscaping, but not very significant berms. So from this road, you can still see a pretty good stretch of that building from the road, quite a bit closer. Kind of transitioned into more of a wrought iron fence in a couple of the different spots. You can kind of see that's just the open area of that property there as you transition to the property line. So these were two examples. I kind of wish I had been able to measure out the height of these berms, but I would say they were well over 20 feet, if not more, that were obviously built as this project was under construction. But this was from, I think, the main road on the side of this facility. And so again, you can see just how tall those are with some landscaping. You can just see the tops of some of those buildings. This was another example. This is a bike trail that went through the city of, this one was in West Des Moines, I believe. That's construction fencing that you see there, so not permanent chain link fencing. This was one of the sites that was under construction. And so you can see with the addition of this bike trail facility, they chose to kind of use that as an active transportation corridor rather than trying to build up huge berms on this particular stretch of roadway, as part of this was on the city's transportation plan as a trail corridor, and so they were able to expand this as this site developed. Caught a picture of somebody using the trail there. You can kind of see, even on this one, they've got some pretty young-looking trees, but as those grow up, they'll be pretty significant in the next 10, 15 years. So this is on the backside. This is, again, in Altoona, Iowa. This is on the rear property, essentially, of the Meta project. And you can see we're parked at the dead end of a street here. On the right-hand side is probably the most significant berm that we had seen done really well. Not a ton of tree plantings, but probably the tallest berm that we were able to see. So as you're driving down the stretch of road on the left-hand side, I think there was probably 6 or 7 homes on that side of the street. And I took this photo because as we were driving, it just, unless you knew what you were looking for, you really wouldn't know what is on the other side of that berm. And so it just struck me as, I kind of went back to my comment of thinking that this huge fence wall or something would be best to screen these properties. West Des Moines actually ended up learning that preserving as much of the natural green space and just elevating it was the better option, and trying to focus on what does it look like versus what can we screen.
David, how far is a setback from that berm?
So
Would you estimate?
I have a couple maps that I can pass out here in just a few minutes. It kind of marked out. We took all these photos and then we tried to go back just to illustrate what is the distance of some of these properties. So I'll pass these out here in just a little bit. I think the largest setback that we had seen was probably 1,300 feet from a property line. I think the smallest that we saw was probably 350. And I think the smaller it got was generally closer to like a roadway or a highway. The larger it got, it was close to some homes, or I guess what would be future homes in the city of West Des Moines. But it was hard to gauge that here on the road, trying to see the distance. So we tried to come back and do a lot of work on what are those actual distances, to try and understand what makes the most sense for a setback. This was, again, back at the initial site there in West Des Moines. It was under construction. They were doing an expansion on it. So this was just an example of kind of what it looks like under construction and one portion of the site. So it was kind of amazing. I mean, I've seen projects under construction here in Raymore, but this was a very large construction operation. We actually stopped at this one as well. I don't think we got a video, but again, the only noise that we could hear from the highway was just the sound of the construction going on. You hear, beeps of the tractors backing up and things like that. But we honestly did not hear any of the buildings that we went to making any ancillary noise. Most of them are adjacent to a highway, so the highway noise tended to outweigh any of the noise that we were hearing from the adjacent properties, which was one of the things we were hoping to really find out there by seeing that. So lastly, again, we kind of did our tour during the day and then went back at nighttime to kind of see what do these look like at nighttime. You can kind of see here, we kind of learned, what I found interesting about this photo here on the bottom is that you can see in person, it's not a very good illustration here, but our headlights were actually the brighter of the lights that were on the road. The street that we're on didn't have any street lights on it. It was a unlit road. But you can see there the site illumination that we kind of found in talking with how West Des Moines handled some of this. What we found out is that most of the lighting that you see here is generally to ensure that the security of the property at nighttime is there, so that their cameras can see what's going on in their parking lots and at their entrances. I was very shocked at the lack of the spillover that you can see out onto the road, which was something that we were expecting to see with some of the photos that in our previous research that we had found. And so West Des Moines kind of gave us some information on the different, specific lighting fixtures and lighting standards that they required. So we talked a lot about, the parking lot may have a different lighting lumens or foot candles than the property line. And so you start to kind of regulate the different areas of the property differently, particularly more so if you're adjacent to one of those sensitive land uses like a neighborhood or a school or a church or what have you, or any existing development, so you're not spilling over into that property. The other thing that was interesting, and one of these photos might show it, this is actually one of the ones that is under construction. Because of its location in West Des Moines, they did permit 24-hour construction. So all the lights that you see there are just temporary trailers that have big light poles on them. Typically, when these end construction, it ends up looking more like this. But like I said, in West Des Moines, they permitted this as a 24-hour operation because there was nothing else around it. So you can see here there was no spillover on the property lines because of how far back it was set, but it does obviously have a little bit more of a glow than the previous photo that I just pulled up. And again, this is on, this actually was, again, the first project that we shared. It was also under construction, so that big light that you see there in the middle was a temporary construction light. What we would generally compare this to, which was surprising to us, was if you were to take a quick glance at this driving down the road, you would think it was a shopping mall or something. I mean, the parking lot lighting just wasn't as significant as what some of our initial computer research had kind of showed and some of the things that we were reading. And it just, through talking with West Des Moines, again, it kind of tells us that if the city is to draft some of these regulations, we felt like we found some really good examples to look towards of what we would prefer and what we would require. And that seemed like it was the lesson that West Des Moines learned as well, of from 2009 up until just a couple months ago when they approved their sixth one. What their regulations are and the things that they make these applicants go through is a lot different than their initial project. And so that will kind of conclude, I guess, from a zoning, land use, development regulation standpoint. I'll pause there with any questions on that before I pass it over to Jordan, in case there are any specific questions about those items. Okay, I'll pass it on to Jordan.
Good evening. So I wanted to touch on some of the economic impact benefits and challenges, and these are things that I've heard from West Des Moines and a couple other communities that I've been able to chat with at a couple conferences. So first I want to touch on the infrastructure improvements that these cities have been able to either make themselves or have seen the data centers do for them. So in one community, through some revenue generated, they were able to fund a 6-mile road. The road helps connect the data centers, but it also opens up a lot of vacant land for future development. And this road can be up to a 6-lane road. It's currently only 2. So that is a pretty cool improvement that they have. And then additionally, in another community, the data center understands that they are a very heavy water user, and this user is in the northwest, and so they have a less water supply than we do here in the Midwest. And so the data center is working to help find another water source solution for that state in that region to help not be such a burden on the water supply. Next, the skills trades workforce participation has increased in the cities and communities that have seen this data center growth. So a lot of HVAC, electrical work, those type of trades have seen a huge increase in the communities because those type of industries are the ones that are servicing these data centers. Additionally, in West Des Moines, the community college now has a certification program for data center technicians, where they can graduate the certification program and start in a data center at, I believe, $60,000. So it's a pretty nice fast track that the community and community partners have seen and taken advantage of for the community. Another benefit is that a data center has less traffic than a traditional distribution center, so there isn't post-construction, there is less truck traffic, there is no truck traffic. And then there is skilled workforce, but there are less employees that are employed at a data center than a typical distribution center, so there's about 40 to 50 maybe total full-time employees at a data center, so there is just a lot less car traffic in general. Additionally, there is a high amount of revenue generated typically by data centers in a community via some different revenues like property tax and those sorts of things that communities have been able to use for projects that they've been interested in, and it's really just been able to help their city grow exponentially a lot quicker than they had planned initially. Also, data centers they've seen a lot of community involvement in giving. So in West Des Moines, the city was able to fund an amphitheater project, which is brand new behind their city hall. Their rec center, they were able to expand it and fast track their rec center development and add a couple of additional sports fields, I guess you could say, due to some of the revenue and just Microsoft being a great community partner in giving. Each community I've spoken to and heard from has said that their data centers are pretty involved in the schools, either through STEM or just tech in general, and they're very involved in making sure that they're a good community partner all around. Lastly, there is a potential for some commercial development around the center, and I say this because in Utah, for example, this city that I heard from, there was one gas station on the road to the data center that was being constructed, and they said within 1 week that gas station was like the top gas station in the state of Utah. So within 2 years, they had 4 or 5 new fast casual restaurants and a grocery store because all of that construction traffic and the people going in and out. So it's not a guaranteed thing, but again, with all of those construction jobs, I think 1,500 at least on a typical data center cluster project of a large magnitude. That's a lot of people in and out of your community, and they want to eat lunch and buy groceries. And then additionally, some of the challenges that we see and that we've heard, David also spoke to it, and Mr. Fearborn, about they are heavy utility users, so they use a lot of energy, a lot of power, and a lot of water. And there are some data centers that are being innovative and finding different ways to cool their data centers. That's what they use the water for, whether they're looping their water system so they can reuse it more, using air to cool it. So it all just kind of depends, but worst case scenario, they're heavy users with energy and water, and then wastewater to discard of the water appropriately. And then workforce is also a challenge, even though it was also a benefit with the little amount of people that a data center does employ, as opposed to traditional distribution or warehouse workers. And then nearby property values. So this one is a challenge because we heard from a couple of cities that the nearby vacant property, their values went up dramatically just because those landowners assume that maybe that buyer is a data center. And so they hike up that price because they think that that buyer is willing to pay that when it may not be a data center. So that is a challenge for other developers in the future. Construction is a challenge. These buildings do take quite a while to build. Some of our regional partners have said that it could take 8 to 10 years to be fully constructed, depending on how many buildings there are. They typically like to do somewhat of a ramp process, so get one building on and then work on building 2 and in that sort of phasing so they can at least have one fully operational. And then lastly, just public and political opinion. These are a non-traditional use, and they are becoming more popular and needed for the society that we live in. But it's just making sure that things are communicated appropriately and that we have open discussion. Any questions?
Is geothermal cooling just way too slow or cost prohibitive to dig those channels, or maybe you don't know?
Well, they also generate a lot of heat, so I don't know if they can, so they also have to get rid of all that. So that's part of the issue, is that the water cools and gets rid of the heat and it pulls the heat out. So I don't know if that, but they also have to funnel that out some way also.
We did hear, so one of the things we learned in West Des Moines is that because these are so, I'll say, new to most cities, the technology of them is constantly changing. And so one thing that they kind of mentioned is that because getting the water utilities, the electric is kind of a need. You can't get around the need for the electricity to run it. But most cities and areas are seeing that they are really heavy water users, and in most cases just they cycle the water through as much as they can and then they get rid of it. And that becomes very expensive for data center users and kind of a suck on the resources for the community. So they did kind of mention that they've seen a little bit of a different approach with each of the centers that they have done, in the sense that the technology is always changing with that. It seems like now those users are realizing that that may not be the best long-term solution for them. So we learned today in a conversation we were having that in one case, instead of constantly cycling through new water into a facility, they fill this giant reservoir once that I think they mentioned it was underground, and that is the water for their facility indefinitely. And now they're getting more. The technology is increasing to just continue to recycle that same batch of water, I guess. So you fill the tank once, and that's your water for the facility, as opposed to constantly drawing in more water from the system. So that was interesting today. That technology seems to change a lot within the last couple of years.
Mr. Mills.
I guess my question is, from looking at who's building these data centers, we're seeing Meta and Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all these different companies. Is their whole purpose to continue to gather all this data and information about every one of us in this country so they know everything that we're doing and monitoring? Or, what is the primary focus of these data centers from a business standpoint?
Yeah, so the data centers are really just storing the data that you're creating. So you think of all the devices that we use. I can't count all the iPads right now in my head, but there are quite a few iPads on this table as well as cell phones. And so even just the amount of data that is on this table right now has to live somewhere. So they're not mining for anyone's data. It's the data that you're choosing to consume that has to be stored somewhere, is what they're doing with that information. I don't think it's all the things that you consume and create. They're not going out to find data. It's just we consume so much that the cloud is full, and so they have to have a building to put all that information in.
We obviously didn't have a chance to go inside of any of these buildings, but if you think about, in that room over there, we have a server rack that has all of our data for the council chambers on it. In essence, they're just large warehouses filled with server racks that Meta owns or Google owns or what have you. But an example that kind of came up today about why this is a bigger thing nowadays than it was in the past when you could just Google something. Think about all the Alexa devices you have in your house. When you ask it, what's the weather in Arizona? It has to go out and find that data somewhere else, grab it, take it back to your device, and then tell you what it is. And so it really is just the fact that things, the lights in my house, I can control those with my phone, and things like that. So it really is kind of the behaviors, it seems like, of society. That sounds kind of philosophical, but everything nowadays is tied to some type of data, even in your car. And so that's really the purpose of it, is when you search for these things, or you share a link on Facebook or what have you, all of that data has to go somewhere, and that's what's driving, because of how much that is becoming part of our society. That's what seems to be driving this type of use nowadays.
And to give a slightly higher level, staff's purpose in being here tonight isn't to get into the political ramifications or try to get into a theoretical discussion with the council or among the council even about what are they trying to do to us. My worry is it's not going to be if we get an application, it's going to be when we get an application, and at a staff level, what are we going to do with that application? The reason we're meeting with the council tonight is we would urge, the fact that we're meeting with the council is a recognition that this is different than we've had before. It's unique. But the land has been watered and these things are growing. And we want to be sure that there is clear direction on not the political ramifications, but if the council is going to entertain these, how is the council going to entertain these? And staff will be looking for clear direction on if we're, because what I don't want is, I don't want staff to be 3 weeks into telling somebody no over and you all have heard many times, for every one application you see, 10 are turned down at the staff level. I don't want to be 3 weeks in a row of hearing from somebody and telling them, no, 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 the council has given us direction on no, and all of a sudden, that's a change in the council's philosophy down the road. Or vice versa, the council has said yes with the following parameters, and suddenly staff is hearing something different at the council level. We want to get that on the table tonight. Staff would encourage, because it's a unique situation, because of the way it kind of came to us originally, that the council be very cautious on approval. That if there's going to be approval, we recognize this is a unique situation, that it would be an application like we've never had before, that there are staff concerns with the effects and the impacts of these coming in. So staff's recommendation, if the council wants to see something out there as far as parameters, basically, if the council is not just going to say no outright to these and let us know it's going to be no outright so you all know what to do, if you're going to entertain something coming in, that there be significant restrictions put on these as a baseline, that depending on the usage, we have the flexibility through the PUD to go even higher than the restrictive uses that would be put on one of these. If they don't want to comply with that, it becomes a hard no on staff's part. With the backing of the council on our hard no, of course. If they do come in, my other caution to the council would be that there be no entertainment of incentives. And we just let them know up front. If you're going to come in, here's the rules you're going to come in by. We're not going to give on those rules. There's no flexibility on those rules. And you're going to pay to come in. Specifically, what you're going to pay on is there's going to be no give on personal property tax. Obviously, 1 million square feet filled with computers generates a significant amount of that. There would be recommendations for other rules. They use a lot of water. They use a lot of electricity, and they use a lot of our sewer, that they have to buy a baseline of that. As Mr. Gress had indicated, if they're buying this much water that keeps us from doing a development that needs the water, they better be paying for that privilege, because we're going to need to find additional water source to continue all of the other development that's going to go with that. All of these hard no's if they're not willing to comply with it, to get us to a comfort level that if one of these comes in, and you can obviously tell where I was a year ago by this conversation, we're very, very cautious on what would be allowed, while at the same time understanding, is it wise of the council to just say under no circumstances no? I think the other thing that I would be recommending to the council, if you would want to entertain some sort of a parameters, you all know that a lot of times we get developers in here who spec, we're going to build it, they're going to come. One of the things we've learned through our researches is if somebody really wants to be in here, I think we would want to be dealing with whoever's going to be using it. If Microsoft comes down here, we want to be dealing with Microsoft from the beginning to be negotiating with them for what are you going to do for the city? What are you going to do? We don't want to be dealing with an engineer. We don't want to be dealing with somebody who doesn't even know who the end user is going to be, or they won't tell us who the end user is going to be. For something of this significance, we would be wanting the council and the staff to be talking with the actual user in this case. Too significant of an issue. Those would be, if the council is going to entertain having something moving forward, those would be at a bare minimum the baselines we would be asking you all to send us forward to research and get back with you on.
Mr. Holman.
I have a question for Mr. Zur. Probably when I was on planning and zoning, we developed our current ordinance and policy on zoning of adult businesses, which can be very unpopular. I remember the education that we got on that was you cannot zone them out of existence. And so therefore our approach to that was heavy regulation. There were certain things we could do is it had to be, for example, 1,000 feet from a school or a church, had to be screened, hours of operation, things like that. I'm assuming those same types of zoning regulations would apply from a legal standpoint to a place like that. Am I correct, sir?
I'm not so sure that they would. I haven't seen anything that's come out that says there is a strict, you cannot have this within your city. I have not seen that from the perspective of adult businesses and free speech that might be associated and all of those other items that were there. There were parameters that said you cannot limit your zoning to exclude them. I have not seen that from a case law standpoint, from the data center standpoint.
Perhaps because this is such a new industry. Yeah, it's not been around as long as adult businesses.
But we'd certainly do everything we could to get as close to it as we possibly could, sir.
Yeah, Sonia.
I have just a few comments and questions. I love that we have people going and learning and researching this, that we're not just waiting for it to appear on our doorstep. I love that we're getting in front of it and thinking through all of those things. I think the idea of having those regulations in place, learning from people who've been through this, made some mistakes and learned from them, is the right way to do it. A few questions I have, and I don't know if we have answers for them or not. Jay spent time on planning and zoning. I did not. Would we create its own zoning area, or would we figure out which one of ours it fits into? That's one question. Second question, were the projects you visited, were they given incentives? Have you seen ones that had incentives or didn't? And third question, I think we talked a little bit about ways that they are learning to be more earth-friendly. That's definitely something I would want to encourage.
Ms. Lee, would you like to speak to the incentives, and then I'll...
Yes. So when we spoke with West Des Moines, David, please correct me if I'm wrong, but they have a TIF on at least building on the first. I think they have a TIF on all of them. And so, but they're not abating like 100% property tax. So, and they shared some more details with us on the agreement. David and I, I'm sorry, have not been able to dig into it deeply yet. But with West Des Moines TIF, they were able to fund that 6-mile road that I was talking about that goes from data center to data center. And that was also part of their incentive. So it was kind of nice that their incentive paid for their incentive in a way, and it helps the city in other ways. They did tell us that another data center near them gave 90% abatement, which is insane, if I'm allowed to say that. Sorry. I'm sorry. It was a choice.
Apology accepted.
Sorry. It was a choice by that city.
Right.
And West Des Moines said that too. That was a direct quote from West Des Moines, not me. So yeah, so those are kind of the incentives that I've seen in play. In Loudoun County, Virginia is another group that I heard from, and they're the largest data center mecca in the United States and have been since 2016. I heard from them at the conference I was at, and they have a very strict incentive policy that's 50 jobs, 50 million CapEx for 50% participation from the county. So they have it very clear cut, but they're a mecca, so people flock to them. So those are kind of the incentive policies that I've seen. In Utah, they also used a CRA, which is similar to a TIF, but in the state of Utah. And I'm not sure the percentage that they used.
Did you see any that didn't get incentives? Or have you heard of ones that didn't get incentives?
I heard today from Missouri Partnerships of a Missouri project that received state and energy incentives, but not local incentives. So there are other partners that can offer assistance to companies, and that can sometimes be enough.
I like that one.
One thing we've learned, if I may, about on the incentive side is that data centers care a lot about time. And so they like when cities are development friendly and they have easy processes when it comes to permitting. Things are clear cut. They can see timelines and those sorts of things. And so we've heard from a couple people that that's sometimes more important to them. And that was an example that Missouri Partnership used with that example that they gave, was that the company didn't want to deal with local incentives because they just wanted to get through the process. And so the state and the energy incentive were enough.
Two things I wanted to add to that, because we did hear that today, and it was with reference to the time. I think that's why it's important that we're having this discussion, because when she references time, it's about knowing what the path is from beginning to end, not so much being able to get there in a month or 2 months, but it's just when they look at a property, they like to know, okay, here's what it is exactly that we need to do so that we can make our best and final approach to the city if we're going to entertain that. And so that was interesting to hear today, that some users just tend to not deal with the city on incentives, that the energy is what they need, and some of the state programs that the state can offer for those are typically enough. I wanted to go back to her comment on the incentives that we heard about in West Des Moines, because it was an interesting approach that maybe we're thinking about if and when anything ever transpires here, but it's something that I don't think the city's ever done, which is with respect to that specific TIF district. The reason that the city of West Des Moines entertained that is because it opened up an area of the city that was geographically very difficult to get to. They have the Raccoon River cuts through that area, and so without extending their road, and I think they said this project advanced that growth by like 15 or 20 years to get across this barrier, but the city ended up fronting the investment for that road to get to that area of the city and with these projects, and that was the incentive that they gave. But the TIF, because the city backed that project and spent the money, the revenues that project generated came right back to the city to pay off the debt that they took out. I don't think the city of Raymore has ever backed any TIFs or made that investment. We typically make the developers do that. But in this case, the city did it because of how much more land that it opened up, which was a very interesting perspective to hear from them.
And you will note that both the staff members, when they're responding, keep continually glancing at me because they know exactly where I'm going to come back around to. Our starting point, I just feel like has to be, these are a challenge. We recognizing the challenge and saying, we regret it, but if you want to come here, this is what it's got to be, and that's just not going to change. And that recommendation would not change from me. You also, council member, brought up the path forward as far as code is concerned. Been a significant amount of discussion about what that would look like. I would hesitate to not have the flexibility to make it more strict. And oftentimes you'll hear staff, when we come to you and we're making a presentation, we say, this is what code says for this zoning, and they meet that code. And so it becomes almost ministerial. With this particular application, staff would want the flexibility to only go harsher in whatever was being offered. And so I think wherever it would be in the city, the minimum requirement would be that it would have to be a PUD, and that there would be a separate document just for data centers that would be both development services and economic development directed. That would be, we hand it to developer or owner ABC, and we say, here's what you got. Oh, and by the way, staff is going to put the following additional restrictions on this for this particular application. Everybody looks at Commerce Center South. That's what's in everybody's mind. The city is growing. There could be other locations. And so we don't want to limit our thinking to something that has a restriction in place already. We always have to be looking to the future. We have to be looking, as Mr. Gress indicated, these things are changing rapidly. The technology that's in them changes every 2 to 3 years. That would also be an item relative to the incentive that we're going to be exploring if the council wants us to move forward with giving you something to digest. I don't like the idea that an appeal on property tax could be put into place. And so we would be looking at the constitutionality of forbidding an appeal of their tax assessment. Because a lot of times we see a Walmart come in, and as soon as they get that personal property, and in fact, we have seen a couple of instances in Cass County where all the way down to the stock racks, they appealed the value of a stock rack so that they could get that personal property pushed down. I would want to explore that because it is such a significant source of revenue that there would be a ban on appealing that based on approval.
Mr. Mills?
One thing that I would like the staff or do a little bit more research, you know, from the things I've read, and it talked about the water, but the energy source. And I guess I got a little bit more concerned when you mentioned about like Evergy or the energy companies making deals directly with these data centers. And we've seen, like in Texas and California and some of these areas over the past year where their grids were overloaded, and it created a major problem. And I guess my fear or concern is the things that we can't control. And if they were getting a deal through, you know, Evergy, does that mean if all of a sudden we have a major grid issue, is it we, the residents, are getting shut down, but they're continuing to get all the energy they need? And I don't know, do we have the ability in our negotiations to deal with that stuff?
Exactly. That's why we bring up as one of the number one challenges the infrastructure that's associated with it. And that would have to be something, again, we would not want to be the only ones telling them no.
Right.
We would want Evergy, if they can't do it, we may be all for it, but if Evergy can't do it, then the agreement with Evergy would need to be, you're not shutting us down to do that. And Evergy would have to be the ones to say we can't do the project.
Don?
I guess first of all, maybe next year we'll have a drone. It'd be great to have a drone up in Iowa. We would have a lot better shots. And one thing I did notice was the transmission lines. I didn't see any photos of those. Typically with these data centers, you have massive transmission lines that run into the data center, and then they run through the neighborhoods or the land they go through. Did you see any of those?
So we did see near all of these. So each facility that we went to does have its own substation dedicated just to this, and then there's obviously the power lines that feed into that. We did see the power lines, but I think because of the context of where they're at in that area being so undeveloped, they didn't stand out to us like I was expecting them to. I mean, I've seen photos of other projects that are not data centers, but very significant power users, where you have, I don't know, 4 to 6 strand poles, 80 to 100 feet tall, metal that are, sometimes 8 to 10 feet in diameter. We definitely saw some large ones, and I can definitely share those with you. We didn't want to put all of the photos in here and bore you with those, but we did see some of those. We've talked a little bit about, like, can the city restrict those to being underground? I know that sometimes comes with other challenges to deal with to get those things underground, but that was kind of a directive of Mr. Fearborn, is to research that and figure out if there are upgrades that are being required because of a project that's requesting to be here, what are the limits from the utility side that the city can have, specifically with respect to the power facilities that are on these. So I don't know if that answers your question. We did get some of those, and I'm more than happy to share them with you as well.
And then secondly, I know this is kind of a heavy topic for neighbors and frankly, some of the research I did over this weekend, but what do we classify a data center? Is it light industrial? Obviously not business park, I would think, or is it heavy industrial? Or do we even have that zone?
Our goal would be that data centers are going to have a classification of their own.
Okay. So right now that would limit, it would have to go through P&Z and through the council for approval before it would not meet anything. That we
Yeah,
currently have.
nothing of this sort is going to be approved at the staff level ever.
Mr. Barber.
In these sites that you looked at, one of the things that bothered me is, it looked like they kind of got a hold of the city and then they expanded and expanded and expanded. Is there, and I think I'm not answering my own question, but I think what we need to do is limit the size. I don't think, number one, we don't have that kind of land, but kind of go with Mr. Zerr's comment that, if you can't say no, can we discourage, somebody from coming in and taking over half our city?
So to answer your question, yeah, some of the research that we have found does limit not only the size of the building, the number of buildings on a parcel, it limits the size of a parcel that somebody can zone for a data center or go through the approval process for. I know in some of those pictures, from West Des Moines' perspective, there's nothing that has been done that wasn't part of their plans originally. It just, as Ms. Lee was mentioning, these take a while to get fully constructed. So that's why that looks like they are constantly expanding, but each one of those that was the approval that was sought by the city. But to answer your question, those are some of the placeholders that we have. These buildings are generally, like I said, a little bit smaller than the buildings that we have as a reference here, but they're very unique in the sense that they're not just enclosed buildings. They have a lot of exterior appurtenances attached to them, but we did find that a lot of cities regulate the things that you just mentioned. Our kind of question mark is we didn't want to make those arbitrary, which is why going to this city to kind of see, here's what the setback looks like. We went back to the map, that's 1,000 feet. So that's our frame of reference. When we started going through this, it was like, is it 500 feet? Is it 400? What's the most appropriate? But it seems like most cities that we looked at have some sort of regulation just like that.
Yes, Jordan.
Mr. Mills, I just want to answer some of your questions about Evergy. Evergy is very heavily involved in the conversations at not only the local level, but the regional and the state level. So maybe I misspoke a little bit. They do give the incentive, but they give an incentive for like innovative energy, or they have a better term for it that they use today, but it's slipping my mind. But it's not just like an energy credit. It's for them doing something for the energy provider. So it's not just, oh, you're coming, here's an incentive. And we heard from Evergy today about large projects, and they have a plan that they're rolling out hopefully within the next month to address large projects similar to every energy provider in the nation, really, that has more of a strict timeline and more defined steps for large users to be able to weed out maybe data centers that aren't as serious, and make sure that they're legit users that are going to use that power. Evergy is very, very aware of how much power is left, that they're not going to push this extra bill onto the residents. They're doing they're not doing that. They've made it very clear, at least to the regional and the local partners, that they're doing everything that will not happen. All of that burden will be on that user. So they'll be responsible for any upgrades that need to be made, but none of that will be pushed back on the resident. I hope that answers your questions as far as Evergy.
Partly, it's just, again, business that size, is it gonna take priority over residential usage when they have to do these rolling blackouts or shutdowns? And I would hope and pray we don't have that problem, but I don't think Texas ever expected to have that problem this past year and stuff like that. So that was my only question is,
Would definitely be something that we need to look at and make sure it's a parameter. Absolutely.
I know that I talked to Bob Houston today, and the county has actually hired a firm to look at zoning code for the county to see if they can address the data center. They haven't done any of the internal work like we have here, and I think we have the skilled staff here to put something together for your consumption and approval at a later time. So I think we're moving in the right direction here, but I know that they'll collaborate somewhat as well on that process. So I think our direction is to move forward with that particular zoning section that deals with data centers, that's for sure.
We'd certainly like to bring you all something for you to digest, as the mayor puts it. Don't want to get too far down the line with anything, obviously, because we're going to want your feedback on, here's a limit I want to see on there, and here's a hard stop no. But tonight was basically to ask you if you would like to see that kind of a document, because we will be, as I warned both of the individuals at the end of the table, this isn't one where we're going to be reinventing the wheel. We're going to be inventing the wheel that we're going to be bringing to you, because we want it to be very Raymore centric. Others can use it as a model, but we have our own issues and concerns, and we started with issues and concerns on this. So we want to be sure they get addressed.
Mr. Burke?
I think it's always a great idea to think about what might be ahead and do as much research as possible. I think it was 2014, on planning and zoning, I said, do we have anything to cover, like if somebody wanted to build a heliport and just, fly to the airport in their helicopter and then take their jet to their work? That happens in other states. So, and people are like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. Anything that we could think of, we need to think of.
Done?
I kind of, with what Councilman Barber said about the size, I know that from what I had heard in Smithville where they have it, they started like at 200 acres and they're up to 1,200 now, building a small city within a city. And I think that would be detrimental, to us here if they bought land, or potentially they could buy some adjoining land, maybe that was not in Raymore, but maybe in the county or something that we didn't have control over. And then all of a sudden, a 200-acre facility at the edge of Raymore could turn into literally, a 200,000-acre solar farm or whatever it may be, because, I do know that, I'm a little cautious about when they say, earth-friendly ways of like cooling water and all that. I would want to see something up front with the commitment that it happens before you break ground, that we have that commitment, not that we are working towards that technology in 20 years, because I think that puts us in a bad spot leading up to that we need to be for sure. And just like, with the right zone and special use restrictions that we want development out here, we just want the right development. So I think it's very good that we're getting proactive on this, and in all the research that you did, we need to make the right choices. So, thank you.
Don, do you have something?
Yeah, I kind of go back to what some of my council members are saying, but when you start talking about being safety, excessive use of water, which we can't afford with our water that we see every day, KC Water, what we can do. We got to have guarantees they're not going to expunge so much water and it starts rolling back to our residents, to us as a city, which is scary. They talk about your filter, your wastewater, how do they get guarantees? Where are you gonna put that wastewater, where it's gonna go, how are you gonna eliminate, where it doesn't soak into the ground in the acreage around where they wanna build, and eventually years down the road, we have a problem. Who guarantees that? Who's gonna clean it up? I mean, there's a lot of questions here that are serious. I know it's gonna be to us, to the city, that we gotta really examine. When you start talking about putting a massive place in here, how far out would it be compared to any future residentials going in that area where they might have to be a half mile or so far because people don't want to have a residential where there's lights on all night long. You know, like a ballpark, they throw a fit when the ballpark lights are on after 10. So, you know, people wouldn't want to build residential to be a really hard one because the lights are on those big buildings. But these are some serious questions we're bringing up now that I know the people and residents I would be worried about. Because when they talk about revenue creation about that, they might have 40, 50 employees, and they've given some stuff to these other places in Iowa. But that don't matter to tell us for sure, because they're nice there, that they're going to be nice down here and give us 6 miles of road. And when you guys said that one area needed the road, so they say, hey, we'll give you the road. But that don't mean that's going to happen. But, you know, I think I really worry about all that stuff, the water, the energy. And when you talk about corporate, big conglomerate, billion-dollar places, you know, like Mr. Mills and them said, if they got into a bind, and they guarantee they're not going to do that, but they had to have that power for that, and they're bigger now, I'm afraid the small guy might have to bite the bullet a little bit, and that would scare me from a city standpoint, what we'd have to do to the residents. You know, and make sure, you know, if they build that, we don't have anything going in the future for schools and like you said, residentials. That would just kill that idea while they're out there by themselves, and they could just roll and go from 200 to 1,200, 2,000 square foot. And if they get to the county where people who own that land, we don't, yeah, we'll sell it to you. Hey, do it on my land. And next thing you know, it's an additional going farther south or east or west, but we have no control over it as a city, and that's scary.
Anyone else? Tom?
Just kind of real quick. This is so new to us. I don't want us to see us get caught in do we need to be the biggest or do we need to be the smallest? I think a lot of it may depend on the partnerships that are created as a result of this. Instead of sprinting down to the finish line, let's just take a couple of steps as we go through this and make that decision as we go along. We don't have to be the biggest. We don't have to be the smallest. We just have to be there and have our ducks in a row at the time it presents itself to us.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have anything? Well, looks like you guys have your homework cut out for you.
We knew we would one way or the other, sir. Nothing on
Well,
this.
that's
That
true.
concludes
That's
staff
true.
report.
All right. Thank you. All right, the next item on the agenda is again our budget as we move through that, the fiscal year 24-25 budget and the CIP. I'll let Mr. Fearborn open up the discussion here.
I thank you, sir. Just one item that we promised we would follow up on relative to the budget. At the last meeting, there was, we had said that there was a kind of a general information given relative to the addition of one police officer position. So I had kind of indicated that we dive into that so that the council had the exacts that were going to be associated with that. So just to quickly run down all of that. So cost for an additional police officer as proposed, and what you saw in the budget for the one that staff is recommending, $96,200. Again, that always depends on who the police officer is. Could be anywhere between 96.2 and 102.37. But using the 96.2 because that's what we presented in the budget. As presented to the council on August 19th, the addition of one more police officer beyond the one that's proposed, we'd also have to be considering the fact that we would need to have an additional vehicle, because now we would be over the threshold for a vehicle. The additional vehicle is, because we lease those now, is $18,500 a year. So using the 96.2 plus the 18.5, total recurring costs for the one additional police officer over the one proposed would be $114,700. The improvement to the chart that was proposed, little bit of clarification, the improvement to the chart that was proposed, the raises, was actually 2.5% in the budget, but Councilmember Mills was using a 2% number to get to his number. So throughout all of this, I'm using the 2% number. The reduction in the total base salaries, because you got to do the reduction that had been proposed, because the budget that's in front of the council has the one officer in it, but not the second one, and it also already has the raises in it. So the reduction from that, if we reduce that by 2%, the impact on, for all of that that is considered, we would have to remove not only the base salaries, but FICA Med, and because when we put it into the budget at the 2.5%, it was base salaries plus FICA Med, as well as loggers. So you know what those amounts are. For public safety personnel, FICA Med and loggers is 23.85% on top of base salary. And for the general population, the add-on percentage is 21.75%. So then we get to the actual reduction. The total salaries that we're talking about are actually paid not just out of the general fund, but the general fund, the park fund, and the enterprise fund. So the reduction of the 2%, including the FICA Med and loggers, in the general fund, it is a reduction of $171,248 from the budget as presented. In the Parks Fund, it is a reduction of $19,412. In the Enterprise Fund, it is a reduction of $19,376. So you take, the police officer would be paid for out of the general fund. You take the $171,248 that would be saved by not increasing the salaries. 171,000 minus the 114,700 total cost leaves a remainder in the general fund of 56,548. The suggestion was made that the addition could go to possibly, if there was enough, paying for an additional parks or public works person to be brought on. Parks worker, the savings in parks, as I indicated, is $19,412. A parks worker or a public works worker, salary, FICA Med, et cetera, 76,816. So within the Parks Department, the 19,412 saved, 76,816 would still leave us in the parks, 57,404 short. Even if we tried to apply, transferred from the general fund the excess, that would still leave us just slightly short. There would not be sufficient funds to pay for a full parks worker. The same exact number exists, of course, for public works as well. That concludes staff report on that particular item, sir.
Okay. Mr. Mills?
So that would, based on your numbers, because we were using 2%, that still is leaving the 0.5% plus all the step raises in the budget.
That's correct,
Nothing touched there.
That would be correct, sir.
Okay.
Anyone else have anything?
Thank you for doing that.
My pleasure, sir.
That gave higher numbers than what I calculated.
So if there's no further recommendations, it'll stay at that particular viewing at this time.
Okay. Second portion of the staff report tonight. Not looking for any direction from the council on this. Just putting it out there because nothing would have to be decided in the immediate. After the last use tax presentation, We heard from a number of the public, heard from some council members who had heard from the public, that had it been limited to transportation and public safety, that there would be more support for it. Whether that be, I would have voted for it, but I didn't. Nobody really disparaging the other two departments that were involved, but just I could have been more behind it relative to in fact, those came up at some of our meetings. So staff did a little bit of research. Want to put into the council's head, and we said it relative to the police officer, that staff is recommending within the budget, that we have to address realities. And maybe that's one of the realities. So, did some research, increasing the existing half-cent transportation sales tax by 1/8%, and establishing a municipal public safety sales tax of 1/8 cent. That 1/8 cent would conservatively raise in the general fund as a municipal public safety sales tax to only be spent on the police department, $468,750. It would raise in the transportation fund an additional $468,750. That gets us the original 58 highway presentation of a 5-year turnaround with other improvements, just rotating through every 5 years and nonstop. It gets us at a minimum from the beginning 4 new police officer positions and the equipment necessary to fund those positions. Just whoosh, right out of the chute. Again, comparisons. So Raymore's sales tax, total sales tax, is currently 2.5%. Belton's current total sales tax is 3.25%. Grandview's total sales tax is 3%. Lee Summit total sales tax, 2.75%. Kansas City total sales tax, 3.25%. That's our competition. Raising the 1/8 in both of those areas would increase our sales tax to be tied with Lee Summit at 2.75%, but we would still be lower than Belton, Grandview, and Kansas City as our surrounds are concerned. Just throwing that out as data for the council to consider moving forward if you wanted to consider alternatives for funding our police department and funding additional transportations. And of course, one of the items that could be argued with this one is there are a lot of people who pay sales tax in the city of Raymore who are not city of Raymore residents, especially at our #1 sales tax generator, Walmart. Just throwing that out there for you to digest and just think about it until such time as maybe staff comes back to you asking what you really think about it. That concludes staff reports tonight, sir.
One, thank you for doing that. And, because again, I'm not saying anything negative about this council or whatever, but a lot of times just government in general, people just hate giving people a pot of money. And I think there's a little greater comfort level when they know it's going for some specific things. And again, like you said, with a sales tax and people outside the area that come to Walmart that sometimes create some extra burden for our police, they're helping to pay the cost of that versus us doing it through property tax or a use tax on our on our residents here. So I do appreciate you taking the time to research that, because that is, I know, important to me. I just very disappointed about only hiring one new officer. I would like to see us do 2 new officers. The only other thing I would ask is, since we got this 56,000 that's kind of there in the 19 and 19, you know, that really would be used, could it still work to get another police officer and we did a 1% raise across the board versus 2.5%?
I need to put the numbers to it, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, what's the flavor of the council here with regard to even spending staff time on something like that?
I mean, just simply, it wasn't half. The cost of the police officer was greater than half of the difference, so it doesn't make sense that that would work.
You know, Don, do you have something?
I just want to say, I think that what Mr. Fearborn presented is, I think, more fair to our citizens. You know, a use tax only penalizes the residents because that's where it's generated from, whereas the sales tax, I've always been a proponent of, we use the people that come to Raymore and we can get tax revenue from them. And, you know, that could help us even down the road with more business development in Raymore, restaurants, shopping centers, whatever it may be. If we have that additional sales tax in place, that could even grow to a bigger number down the road with more establishments that could charge sales tax to outside people. So I think it's an excellent point and a good alternative to what we tried in the past.
Okay. Tom?
Yeah, I agree on that. I think with so much sales tax revenue coming just from Walmart and Sam's Club alone, from out of Raymore, from out of who we are, they're coming in to shop and they leave, but they're leaving their tax money here by spending it here in our city, which is great. Appreciate the numbers you do. You've always been a numbers guy. You do a very good job. You always have, and you can bring back to us and break that down, and that's very appreciated. Most city managers don't have what it takes to do that. They just don't. They couldn't put all those numbers together. They really couldn't. You've done a great job. You always have as a city manager with those numbers. But I am kind of what you're saying. If you're directly going for the people, what you're going to do, whether it's an 8 cent, for it's a police, it's cars, what they want, the service, they're on board because most of the people I ever talk to, even during 12 hours out there running election, their whole concept is safety, safety, safety. If it's for the police, if it's for something to save us and our families, they're good for that. They really want that safety, and that's why people move here. I've asked people for years from Blue Springs, Lee Summit, why are you moving to Raymore? Because we heard you're the safest city around, and we come here for the safety, the primary, then the other stuff, the schools. But they do concern in this day and age with safety, and we are one of the safest cities there is. So thank you.
The things that you and Mr. Baker just brought up are for future thought and consideration. Mr. Mills, I think, is asking that the changes be made to the budget where we reduce the pay raise.
I was talking about the future stuff, but we were kind of discussing. That's where it's on the table, we can talk about. Yeah, I mean, those are a positive future, what you're looking at.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah, I don't think there's an appetite for that, Brian, sorry. All right, if there's anything else? Do you have anything else?
If you have other, sir, I have other.
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. As we have, you knew I was going to bring this up. So as we have been speaking tonight, do want to point out Channel 9's lead article that currently firefighters are battling a massive landfill fire in Sedalia. It's not if, it's when, right? That concludes staff reports.
Anybody have anything else? If not, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you.